I title this The Awakening Process because it was quite a journey of discovery and a lot of information to try to ingest and process. And the catalyst of this journey of discovery was the calves. But it's very possible that the journey wouldn't have ever even started if a different journey hadn't also been underway. One in which I'd been researching my food sources and slowly gaining an awareness of the reality of some of my choices. Now, the goal is not to say what anyone should or should not eat, but it's overwhelmingly common for most of us to have a huge disconnection between our food and the reality of that food source. If through research I hadn't recently seen what a veal pen looks like or what a dairy calf isolation pen looks like, I probably would have dismissed those random objects on the side of the road as something I didn't recognize and therefore didn't think about again. But now there was visual recognition, which led me to suspect, which led me to investigate, which allowed me to know. Acknowledging the presence of the calves woke me up to acknowledging the presence of all the adult cows, and there are a lot of them. Of course I'd seen them, but I wasn't really thinking about them. This time it wasn't a case of disconnection so much as a case of conditional norms. Meaning, seeing the cows in Point Reyes didn't present something visually new, it was a continuation of what I'd already been seeing. Cows are everywhere in California, especially your drive out to Point Reyes National Seashore. But learning that the elk were going to be shot because of the cattle not only woke me up to how many cattle were there, but to the fact that I was in a national park unit, and killing wildlife there for cows sounded a little weird, at least to me. So then you start the long journey of trying to understand the complicated history of the seashore and what dairies are doing in a national seashore in the first place. And along the way, you start to hear the standard justifications that have been preached and promoted for so long that now your average Joe repeats them as fact whether he or she actually knows anything about Point Reyes or not. Such as, the ranchers are actually good for the wildlife and habitat. The seashore wouldn't even exist without the ranchers. The ranchers worked hand in hand in the creation of the seashore. The legislation always intended the ranchers to stay. The ranches are crucial to the local economy and necessary for food. None of which turn out to be true. Next come the arguments using your buzzwords about sustainability and local and family and the importance of grazing and the benefits to the park by the very presence of the ranches. Now, in order to actually refute any of these claims or agree with any of these claims, it behooves one to actually learn about these topics. Therefore, I had to start learning more about plants and about wildlife and about ecology in general. This led to another form of awakening because when I look out over a landscape, I no longer just saw green and categorized everything generically into plants. I then began to recognize different plants. Native plants, invasive plants, perennial plants, annual plants, what plants played what role, and not only that, but the importance that different plants hold for different animals within the seashore. Eventually you learn that the low-cut, golf course-looking areas symbolize a lack of biodiversity, a lack of habitat, a lack of native plants, and the dominant presence of invasive plants. This is affectionately referred to as the pastoral zone, but the pastoral zone is not habitat. It is the graveyard of former habitat. And then you realize that you've been driving past these habitat graveyards while praising them for as long as you can remember. I can still hear myself, so happy not to see apartment buildings and high-rises. Ooh, I can't wait to show my family and friends Sonoma's green rolling hills. Completely devoid of wildlife. I'm talking about the green rolling hills throughout Sonoma, throughout Marin, throughout other counties surrounding the Bay Area. Because when you look out there, once again, you're not looking at biodiverse habitat. You aren't looking at elk and antelope and wolves and other animals running around out there. You're not seeing any of that. But if you do look closely, you'll see cattle grazing. And that's irregardless of whether it is private land or public land. That's why these hills mirror the pastoral zones out in Point Reyes. It's not wild habitat. It's grazing land. California has been converted from wild to agricultural. even where we didn't mean to, because all of those brown plants that turn into fire fodder before anything else are invasive annuals introduced to California. Strangely enough, the land in Point Reyes looks even worse than grazed lands outside of Point Reyes. These are the ghetto golf courses, land that is shockingly degraded for anywhere, not just for being within a national park unit. But despite that, and despite their own studies, we have a park service and even conservation groups saying things like Point Reyes is a model for how farming and wildlife can coexist. You hear that what we need is not less cows, but more cows. That agricultural livestock are what we need to stop the spread of agricultural livestock plants. That to fight the carbon emissions from the cows, we don't need less cow poop. The state needs to give financial incentives to the ranchers to produce even more poop. So finally we circle back to the beginning, the calves. Because every negativity listed in this presentation, every issue, every challenge facing Mother Nature points back to the industry that at its core engages in an activity that by itself should be enough for us to say no. But our attachments to what we know, what we're comfortable with, what we were raised to think, traditions and cultures, outweigh the quest for the greater good. Thus I end this presentation with a question. On the journey of believing what we want to believe, which came first? That the source of the problem is the solution to the problem? Or that babies don't need their mothers, and mothers don't want their babies?